In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be going through my top 15 faith builds in the game. A lot of people were watching some of my earlier Elden Ring videos commenting that they really enjoyed seeing the gameplay from various builds, and in this video I thought I would go through sort of not only the progression of faith builds throughout the game, but what I think good faith builds are as you make your way through the game, showcasing some of the builds that I've done. So starting at level 50 first, let's get into level 50 faith builds, and the first one we'll take a look at is Templar. This is kind of your de facto paladin build. At level 50, you can play this very effectively. You are probably going to be using a medium shield at this level in order to, be able to put points into faith. Otherwise, your points are going to have to go into strength to get a great shield. And you're going to have a sacred seal, and you're going to set the infusion on your straight sword to either flame art or sacred in order to take advantage of that faith scaling. So your stats are going to look like vigor, endurance, faith, basically, and a little bit of strength in order to use a decent medium shield. And you're going to lean into like buffing and some early game spells while you do block counters and, do like a lot of stance breaking with those. That's kind of the strategy of that build. It works very, very well early on in the game. So the next build we're looking at level 50 is the Sword Sage. This is modeled after using the Sword of Night and Flame. You can play with the Sword of Night and Flame rather early on in the game if you build yourself correctly for it. It is a pretty stat-hungry weapon since this needs a lot of intelligence and faith to use. So your health and your endurance are going to be kind of low when you're using this weapon very early on in the game, like at level 50. But you can use it at this level, and it's very, very powerful weapon, even after nerfs and everything like that. So if you want to use this weapon very early on, then Sword Sage is the build to use, and it's very, very strong. And this brings me to my last level 50 faith build that I would recommend, which is the Black Flame Apostle build. This is a build that focuses on buffing your weapon with either Blood Flame Blade or Black Flame Blade, being able to cast Black Flame incantations or other faith-based incantations like Catch Flame. And essentially the way it works is you're going to use some sort of weapon that has native bleed buildup on it by default that can still be buffed, like Uchigatana, Naga Kiba, Night Rider Flail, Bloodhound's Fang, something like that, and you'll be using the Godslayer seal in your left hand, and you're going to be buffing your weapon with this to either give yourself more bleeding or to give you the Black Flame effect, and then cast spells using Black Flame. So that's kind of the way that you're going to set that up. So that's another really fun one to play, and there aren't a ton of low-level Faith builds that are great, in my opinion. A lot of the best spells for Faith are found mid or later in the game, but these are ones that are really strong that you can still play very early on and get effectiveness out of. So moving on to the level 100 Faith builds that I think are excellent. The first up is the Death Blade. This is sort of an advancement of the Sword Sage. You're still going to be using the Sword of Night and Flame, so you're going to have intelligence and faith in this build, but you're not going to be leaning into using it as much as you were in the Sword Sage build. Here you're also going to be using the Gelmir Glintstone Staff or the Prince of Death Staff, and you're going to be casting death magic spells like Rancor and Ancient Death Rancor. And what I like to do with this build is like throw up Ancient Death Rancor or a couple charges of it, and then wait till it starts to like hit into the enemy, and then go for the uses of Night and Flame, the Sword of Night and Flame, using like Night Comet off of it, while the enemy is sort of interrupted by all the skulls hitting into them, and it works really, really well. You have a good melee option with your Sword of Night and Flame as well as Night Comet, and then you have a big focus on death magic, and it is a ton of fun to play. One of my favorite builds in the game. The next build I want to talk about for 100 builds that are faith-based is the Hellfire Herald build. This is a dual-wield greatsword build where we're using 2 iron greatswords that are either infused with the Sacred Infusion or Flame Art Infusion. You can change this back and forth throughout the game as you're facing enemies that might be resistant to Holy or might be resistant to Fire, etc., which is something that's really nice about the build. But essentially the way this build works is that you're going to be able to buff yourself using like Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, etc. You can use Determination or Royal Knight's Resolve on your weapons, buff them, and then do jump attacks, taking advantage of talismans that boost that, Raptor's Black Feathers, etc. And you just deal tons of damage doing jump attacks with this setup. And you still have the ability to cast spells because you're faith-based. You can use Lightning Spear, you can heal yourself, as I mentioned, Golden Vow, so it works really, really well. So next is the Blasphemous Beastman or Blasphemous Beastmaster build. This is a really, really fun build that focuses on the use of beast incantations and also the Blasphemous Blade. So this is kind of like a strength faith build. That way you're getting the most out of Clawmark Seal, and Clawmark Seal and Syncadia, the dagger, are both going to boost beast incantation. So you'll have the dagger in your offhand and the Blasphemous Blade in your right hand. Use the weapon art of Blasphemous Blade and attack with it as needed, and then swap it to the Clawmark Seal and cast your, beast spells like Stone of Garong or Beast Claw or Bestial Sling when you want to cast those spells, and you can still buff with like Golden Vow or Flame Grant Me Strength, etc. So you have a lot of high damage with this build. You have ranged options, and you have a good melee option in Blasphemous Blade as well. So it's a ton of fun to play. Very good Strength Faith build. And then lastly, for level 100 Faith builds, we come to the Frenzied Acolyte build. This is a Arcane Faith build that focuses on the use of using like some of the Frenzy or Madness spells in the game. It has a huge focus on fire damage, since those spells deal fire damage, and it is absolutely devastating. It's one of the most fun builds to play, and it's kind of out of this box. You're going to use spells like the Flame of Frenzy and Frenzied Burst. Both of those are really good. One is like really good at just melting bosses, and the other is really good at picking off targets from afar. So essentially, the way this build works is that you're going to be casting with the Dragon Communion Seal, so you're going to pump Arcane and Faith, and then in your left hand, you're going to have either the Frenzied Seal, the Gravelstone Seal, or Godslayer's Seal. You can actually have all three of them and just rotate between them. And then, when you want to cast a Frenzied spell, you'll have the Frenzied Flame Seal in your left hand to get the most damage from Frenzied spells. Or if you want to cast like Black Flame, you'll have the Godslayer Seal in your left hand. Or if you want to cast like Lightning Spear, you can put the Gravelstone Seal in your left hand. You can just, switch between them. So this is kind of like a pure caster build that allows you to really take advantage of, the most damage you can get for some of these spells, because you're buffing it with the talismans that buff them with your left hand while casting effectively with the Dragon Communion Seal and the Dragon Communion Seal stat spread in the right. So from here, we'll go on to the level 150 Faith builds, and first up here is the Crusader. This is kind of an advancement in some ways of the Templar build. You are going to be two-handing a Greatsword more than you're going to be block countering, but you still have the option to use the Brass Shield if you want, and you can use Barricade Shield on that for places where it makes sense to do block counters if you need blocks. The general concept of this build is that you're going to be using a Greatsword, either the Gargoyle's Greatsword or the Iron Greatsword, set it to the Sacred Infusion or Flame Art, and you're going to be pumping your faith sky high and using the Erdtree Seal in order to cast incantations like Elden Stars that deal significant damage and still be able to buff yourself with like Golden Vow, Blessing of the Erdtree, etc. And what I like to do with the Greatsword is I like to use Sword Dance on it. It's very, very strong skill that can often one-shot most enemies for very cheap. And so it plays a little bit differently than the Templar build because you're kind of more aggressive in the way that you play if you're using Sword Dance, and you have insane spellcasting ability by this point of the game. So next we come to the Blasphemous Herald build, and this is sort of a combination between the Blasphemous Beastman build and the Hellfire Herald build, because we are using the Blasphemous Blade in a dual Greatsword setup like the Hellfire Herald build, but the Hellfire Herald build doesn't use the Blasphemous Blade. So basically the way this build works is you're going to focus on using the Blasphemous Blade in your right hand, and maybe like the Gargoyle's Black Blade in your left hand, or the Gargoyle's Greatsword in your left hand infused to either fire or sacred. And this is going to allow you to do jump attacks and also still use Blasphemous Blade effectively and Taker's Vow, the weapon skill Blasphemous Blade, when you need, and still be able to cast incantations when you want them as well from using like the Clawmark Seal, because you'll have Strength and Face with this build. So you'll have a lot of different options, and it's kind of a blend of those two builds that's really, really strong. So this takes me to the Black Flame Bushido build, which is kind of a progression of the Black Flame Apostle build. And the idea here is that you're either using the Cross Naginata or Nagakiba and going with Keen Scaling, which is very good on both of those weapons, and then splitting your attributes between Dexterity and Faith, and then buffing the weapon with either like Black Flame Blade or Blood Flame when appropriate, and still casting spells like Black Flame using Golden Vow, Scouring Black Flame, and casting those with the Godslayer Seal for increased effect. And the reason that we play this at level 150 is that it's very difficult at lower levels to split your attributes between two main stats like that, like offensively. Like if you tried to go Dexterity, Faith at lower levels, you wouldn't have any points for Vigor, Mind, Endurance, etc. So this kind of a build that you have to play at higher levels. And essentially what you're going to do is just like buff and cast spells. And you can use something like Phantom Slash on the Cross Naginata, which I really, really like. Or if you're using Nagakiba, you can use Sword Dance or Double Slash, which are both really, really good. And this brings us to level 150 to level 200 builds. These are effectively New Game Plus or Journey 2 builds, because by the time you get some of the weapons or spells you need in this build, there's not much of the game left. So these will be effective in a second playthrough. So the first build is the Sword Saint build. This is a build that focuses around using the Sacred Relic Sword and its devastating weapon skill Wave of Gold, which kind of shoots out an AoE in front of you, like that's a wave that deals damage over a very long period. It's very expensive, it's very high damage, and it's not something that you're going to use all the time. So what I've done is I've paired this build with Sword of Milos in the offhand, which gives you 5 FP back when you kill enemies. So you can jump attack, with 2 great swords, which is, a very good setup for a lot of builds. But then you can also use Wave of Gold when you want, and because you have points in Faith for this build, you can also buff with Golden Vow or Flame Grant Me Strength, or use other incantations. And it's absolutely devastating to have that huge AoE when you need it, and then jump attack when you don't. So the next build is the Drake Knight build. This is a build that is a Strength Faith build that focuses on using the Magma Worm Scale Sword and the Clawmark Seal. Because it's Strength Faith, that way you can cast incantations using the Clawmark Seal effectively, like things like Golden Vow or Flame Grant Me Strength. And since the Magma Worm Scale Sword does both physical and fire damage, that works very well. And this build focuses around optimizing the damage of Magma Guillotine, basically. This weapon skill is absolutely deadly. It can one-shot bosses, sometimes two-shot bosses. So this build is all about using that, and frankly, if you're playing in New Game Plus, this thing will just slaughter things, but you don't have to use it in New Game Plus. You can play it earlier on in the game if you want. Still absolutely devastating. So the next build is the Red Lightning build, and this is a build that focuses on using lightning spells, including some of the Red Lightning spells. And you're going to cast spells like Golden Vow, Lightning Strike, Lightning Spear, Lanciax's Glaive, Frozen Lightning Spear, and Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear when using this build. And effectively, what you're going to do is you're going to cast spells using the Erdtree Seal, but holding the Gavelstone Seal in your left hand to buff the damage of a lot of these spells, and you're going to just crank Faith. And that's kind of the build. You're going to be focused on purely casting most of the time in order to kill things. You're going to use like Lightning Strike or Lightning Spear to pick off things at a distance. You can use Lanciax's Glaive in order to AoE enemies, and you have lots of different spells that you can use for different scenarios. And it's a ton of fun to play, and if you like playing like a lightning caster build, that's definitely a fun one. So the next build is probably one of my top 5 builds that I've made personally, and that's the Black Blade build. And what I really love about this build is the style it has. Malekith's Black Blade and his armor are just phenomenal, and we're going to be using both for this build, along with a Clawmark Seal in order to cast spells. So this is a Strength Faith build, and the idea is that you go into boss fights, you cast the Black Blade incantation from a range to start off the fight that does some damage and rips off 10% of the max health of the boss, and then you move into melee range and use Destined Death from the sword. These two will stack to rip off 20% of the max health of the boss, and that health does not come back once the debuffs expire, so that's 20% instantly gone. And then you'll obviously, just fight normally using attacks and Black Blade incantation from range as necessary. And then lastly, we come to the Pyromancer build, and this is arguably one of the most fun builds to play in the game. It's so powerful, it's just fun to play. And the idea here is that we're actually using some of the Fire Giant incantations, and the reason this is a Journey 2 build is that you don't get these incantations until very, very late in the game, or most of them. So in order to have like everything you need for this build, it's going to take you the vast majority of one playthrough. So it's kind of a New Game Plus playthrough. And what you're going to do is you're going to have the Erdtree Seal in one hand and Giant Seal in the other. And you're going to cast spells used with the Erdtree Seal, having very, very high faith. And you're going to cast spells like Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, but then other spells like Burn O' Flame, Flame of the Fell God, Flame Fall Upon Them, and Giant's Flame Take Thee for massive, massive damage. And during your New Game Plus playthrough, you'll probably get a second Giant Seal, like halfway or further into that playthrough, and then you can actually use 2 Giant Seals. But the idea is that you're just flinging fire at enemies like the whole game, managing your FP, and it's just absolutely devastating, some of these fire spells, and it's a ton of fun to play. So that wraps up my video on my top 15 Faith builds for the game. Obviously, I showcase these using mine, and some people's builds will vary slightly from these depending on, what talismans they're using and how their stat allocations are, but the concepts should be somewhat similar to what I'm showcasing here. And if you guys like this video, if you want to see me do other showcases for other types of builds that we've made, let me know in the comments. I know a lot of people were commenting on some of the videos I made recently for Elden Ring that they really love just watching the different builds. So let me know if that's something you'd like. Did I miss any builds that are extremely powerful? Let me know in the comments below.